The void itself seemed to shudder as though it feared what was about to be born within it. A name carried across galaxies, whispered in blood and memory. A name that in another universe belonged to a weaponized man of claw and rage. But here, within the endless dark of Warhammer 40,000, that name was twisted into something more feral, more enduring, more tragic. Imagine a being who has known only war, who has felt the kiss of blades across his flesh 1,000 times only for his body to knit itself whole again. A predator designed not for survival alone but for an eternity of battle. What would such a creature become if hurled into the nightmare that is the 41st millennium? Would he be a savior in shadows, or would his unquenchable hunger for violence add yet another cruel scar to a galaxy already broken by war? This is not a tale of heroes or villains. It is the echo of claws against ceramite, the stench of ozone and blood, and the quiet horror of a soul who cannot escape himself even when planets burn around him. If this descent into the grimdark excites your imagination, then stay with me. Share this vision, let others hear it, and walk further into the abyss alongside us. Like, subscribe, and carry this story forward, for what follows will not only challenge what you know of Wolverine, but of Warhammer itself. Now, before we plunge into the iron tides of fate, let us glimpse the path ahead. The first thing he noticed was the weight of the air, thick and poisoned, pressing against his lungs like a slow suffocation. Even his healing factor fought to keep pace with it, knitting torn tissues as toxins gnawed at him. He was lying on metal, jagged and cold, the vibration of distant machinery rattling through the iron beneath his body. The scent came next: burned oil, promethium exhaust, the acrid tang of ozone. It was a smell of industry gone mad, of a place where the earth itself had been carved open and enslaved. He forced himself upright, claws half unsheathed out of instinct, and found himself surrounded by towers of iron and smoke that climbed into a sky he could not see. The world had no horizon, only a labyrinth of chimneys, furnaces, and looming silhouettes that belched fire into the darkness above. His mind searched for bearings, but nothing fit. This was not the wilderness, nor the weapon labs of his past, nor any battlefield he remembered. It was older, harsher, as though entire centuries of war had already scarred the place before he ever set foot in it. The ground trembled beneath the march of boots, hundreds of them in unison, and a metallic voice carried through the haze. The words were guttural, half mechanical, but something in the tone told him they were commands. He wasn't alone. Figures emerged from the smoke, metal glinting beneath the red glare of furnace light. Their bodies were armored, not with the clean lines of soldiers he once knew, but with slabs of iron augmetics grafted into flesh, and weapons wired into their very limbs. Skitari. Their glowing ocular lenses swept the smoke like hunting beasts. They moved in tight formation, each step a perfect rhythm of steel and flesh, each rifle humming with the stored bite of energy. Wolverine did not know their names or their creed, but his instinct screamed what mattered most. Predators, territorial, dangerous. They had already marked him. The first volley split the air, beams of searing energy cutting through the haze like lines of white fire. He threw himself sideways, claws flashing as he dove for cover behind a twisted beam of machinery. Metal slagged and hissed as the shots bit into it, filling the air with sparks and vaporized steel. His healing flesh sizzled from a near miss, the skin closing as quickly as it burned. He snarled low in his throat, not a sound of pain but of the old familiar rage rising. The animal in him did not analyze or plan. It wanted blood. He burst from cover, a blur of muscle and claws closing the gap before the Skitari could adjust. Their augmetic reflexes were fast, but his were faster. The first fell with a slash that tore through armor as though it were paper, the claws shrieking against the metal before sinking into the flesh beneath. Sparks lit his face as he ripped sideways, sending the body crumpling into the grime. The others responded without hesitation, pivoting in unison, their rifles roaring. Bolts slammed into his chest and shoulder, spinning him back with the impact. He staggered, coughing blood that already began to clot in his throat. He straightened, smiling with his teeth red, and leapt again. The fight was chaos contained in seconds. Claws slashed, rifles hissed, and blood steamed on the iron floor. For every shot that punched holes into him, his body sealed them with furious speed. For every claw that struck, another soldier fell, rent open in a storm of sparks and gore. Yet he knew this was not victory. These soldiers were not surprised, not afraid. They fought with the cold efficiency of machines, their deaths little more than malfunctions in a greater system. More were coming. He could hear their boots, the thrum of heavier machinery, and the low drone of something vast awakening. He ducked into the shadows of a shattered foundry, the air stinging his lungs with burned ash. He pressed his back to the wall, listening. The Skitarii did not speak, but the mechanical chorus of their movements gave them away. They were closing in, methodical, relentless. His claws dripped with blood that steamed against the cold metal floor. He wiped it across his jaw without thought, eyes scanning the factory's maze of gears and chains. This was not his world. He had no allies here, no safe place, no mission but survival. And yet survival was what he did best. The ground shook with a deeper rhythm now, heavier than the marching soldiers. A low grinding roar echoed through the furnaces, and out of the smoke stepped something far larger than a man. A construct of iron and fire, its limbs bristling with weapons, its furnace heart glowing behind a cage of steel. A war servitor, mindless and brutal, its flesh long since replaced with gears and augmetics. It locked onto him with an inhuman screech of gears, raising an arm that ended not in a hand but in a rotary cannon already spinning to life. The rattle of its barrels filled the air like a swarm of hornets. Wolverine crouched low, claws gleaming, lips peeled back in a snarl. And then the storm broke. The servitor unleashed a torrent of fire that shredded the walls around him, tearing chunks of steel into molten shrapnel. He rolled, dove, felt rounds rip into his back and tear through muscle before his body sealed itself again with searing agony. He hit the servitor head-on, claws driving deep into the armored plating. Sparks screamed into the air as he ripped, gouging at gears, tearing cables. The machine bellowed, hydraulic fluid spraying like arterial blood. It swung its massive arm, striking him with a force that would have broken any other spine. He felt ribs crack, heel crack again. He refused to fall. His claws punched through the servitor's faceplate, driving into whatever organic remnants lingered inside. The machine shuddered, groaned, then collapsed in a heap of sparking ruin. He pulled his claws free, dripping with oil and blood mingled together. He stood over the corpse of the machine, panting, his chest heaving as his body knit itself whole again. For a moment, the only sound was the hiss of cooling metal. Then faintly through the smoke, he heard the sound of Vox voices. Calm, commanding, reporting. They knew what he was. They knew where he was. And more would come. Wolverine spat blood into the ash and turned toward the darkness. He did not know what world this was, nor what gods it served. All he knew was that he was in a place of iron and smoke, and already it wanted him dead. The hive ended not with walls, but with wounds. Past the manufactorum and the iron canyons of machinery, the land bled outward into an endless desert of ash, slag, and rusted bones of forgotten engines. It was not sand beneath his boots, but powdered stone and ground metal, hot to the touch, clinging like poison dust in his throat. The sky was a permanent bruise of gray and brown, sun smothered behind centuries of smoke. Wolverine stumbled into this wasteland after fleeing the Skitarii patrols, lungs burning, every sense sharpened by the strange silence that lingered beyond the reach of the hive's furnaces. There was no sanctuary here. The ash wastes themselves were predators. The wind howled across the plains, carrying with it the echoes of industry. Distant detonations, the groan of collapsing spires, the thunder of armored convoys. Beneath it all, a different sound haunted the silence, the faint scrape of claws and the guttural rasp of something breathing. He paused, sniffed, and tasted the air on his tongue. The scent was wrong, feral, musky, tinged with corruption. Not human, not clean, not natural. He turned slowly, claws sliding free with that old metallic snick, just in time to see the first of them crawling from a fissure in the earth. They were not men, not anymore. Mutants bred from the hive's discarded poor, twisted by radiation and hunger. Their bodies stretched thin, their skin blistered with sores. Their eyes glowed with feral hunger and their teeth were filed into jagged points. They wore rags. Some carried scavenged blades, others bone clubs, but their strength was not in their weapons. It was in their numbers, dozens then scores, slithering out of the shadows of the broken landscape. Wolverine crouched, low and coiled, and the old animal part of him purred. For the first time since his arrival, he was not the hunted. He was the wolf, and these were prey. The first wave rushed him, shrieking like carrion birds, and he met them head-on. His claws sliced through skulls and collarbones, blood spraying hot across the ash. The mutants clawed and bit, teeth snapping at his arms, nails raking his flesh. He felt skin tear, tendons rip, and then knit themselves back together even as he fought. Every strike was a storm, every heartbeat a kill. He moved in arcs of violence, carving sways through the mob until the ground itself was slick with red. Still they came, scrambling over the bodies of their own fallen, driven not by fear but by hunger so deep it drowned all reason. He fought for what felt like hours, though the sun, or what passed for it, never shifted in the ash-dark sky. When at last the ground grew quiet, he stood over a mound of bodies, his chest heaving, blood, his and theirs, dripping down his arms. His healing had kept him whole, but exhaustion was something even he could not heal. He dropped to one knee, claws still gleaming, every nerve thrumming. Then he heard it, a laugh. Not the broken shriek of mutants, but a guttural, bellowing laugh that rolled across the ash like thunder. He turned, eyes narrowing, and saw them cresting the horizon. Massive figures, green-skinned and hulking, their crude armor hammered together from scrap metal, their weapons bristling with rust and brutality. Orks, a raiding band, their bikes kicking up clouds of dust, their banners ragged and crude glyphs daubed in blood. Wolverine had never seen their like, but every instinct screamed what he needed to know. These were warriors built for war and nothing else. He had cut his way through mutants, but the true predators of this wasteland had found him. The first bike roared past, its rider swinging a jagged cleaver the size of a man's arm. Wolverine ducked, the blade catching only air, and he slashed upward, claws carving through wheel and flesh in a spray of sparks and gore. The bike crashed, fire and screams tumbling into the ash. The Orks cheered, not deterred but delighted, for here was a fight worth having. They swarmed him, bellowing their war cries, crude shooters roaring. Bolts tore into his chest, shredding muscle, bursting out his back in sprays of blood. He staggered, roared, and kept moving. He ripped through one orc, gutted another, his claws clanging against crude armor before finding purchase in green flesh. They hit back like hammers, blows that shattered ribs and cracked his jaw, but still he rose. The ash waste became a killing ground, a dance of death between one immortal man and an army that refused to die quietly. When the dust settled, the horizon burned. The orc band was shattered, their machines wrecked and bodies strewn like broken dolls. Wolverine knelt among them, chest torn open, lungs wheezing as they stitched themselves together again. He spat blood into the ash, his body mending, but his mind unsettled. For every foe he killed, more would come. This place was not a wilderness to be conquered. It was a crucible that tested and broke everything within it. And yet in the distance he saw lights. Not fire, not war bands, but the faint ordered glow of a convoy winding across the ash plains. Massive engines, armored hulls, banners snapping in the poisoned wind. The Imperium. Humans armored and armed, moving with discipline and purpose. He did not know whether to run toward them or away. He had felt the bite of their soldiers already, seen the cold machine logic of their hunters, but he also knew he could not wander these wastes forever. He rose slowly, claws retracting with a click, and turned toward the convoy. His healing body was whole again, his senses raw, his instincts alive. He was a predator among the ash wastes, but here predators were many and survival was not enough. The Imperium had seen him once. They would see him again. The convoy was not salvation. It was a net cast wide across the wastes, and he was the beast caught in it. At first he shadowed them, watching from the ridges as their armored carriers rolled across the ash, their banners bearing the twin-headed Aquila snapping in the wind. Steel tracks toward trenches in the gray earth, and Vox towers spat bursts of coated light to unseen watchful eyes. He thought of slipping past, of letting them vanish into the distance, but hunger gnawed at him and exhaustion pulled at his limbs. When night fell, and in the ash wastes night was only a deeper layer of suffocating shadow, he crept closer. He did not make it to their fires. Sensors tracked him, Auspex readings screaming his presence even through the cloak of darkness. The first shot hit him low, burning through his thigh and sending him sprawling into the dust. His claws sprang out instinctively, but by then the floodlights had snapped on, washing him in blinding white. Dozens of lasguns trained on him, disciplined and unwavering, the soldiers behind them armored in flak and steel, the insignia of the Astra Militarum stamped on their breastplates. He heard the click of safety releases, the low bark of orders shouted in unison, and then the weight of boots as they surrounded him. He rose, blood already clotting around the wound in his leg, and growled low, but this time he did not charge. These men were not the feral mutants or the howling orcs. They were an army, trained and countless, and every eye on him held the calm certainty of discipline. To fight here would not be survival. It would be slaughter, his or theirs. He raised his claws high, the metal gleaming in the white light, then slowly drew them back into his fists. The soldiers bound him in chains thick enough to anchor tanks, shackles humming with energy fields that bit into his skin, stinging him with every movement. He snarled, but he let them drag him into the armored maw of their convoy. Inside was darkness lit by the occasional flicker of a data slate, the air thick with oil and sweat. He could hear the murmur of soldiers outside, their voices hushed, their words just within earshot. They spoke of him as though he were a myth. "Clawed beast," one muttered. "Demon in flesh," another whispered. A younger voice asked if he was Astartes, one of the Emperor's angels of death fallen from the stars. The silence that followed said more than words. He was something else, something they did not understand. They delivered him to a bastion carved into the edge of the wastes, a fortress of stone and steel marked with banners of the Imperium. Torchlight flickered against Gothic walls, and statues of saints loomed over the courtyard as if to judge him. He was dragged through its halls and thrown into a cell deep below, the chains locked tight, energy fields humming like a hive of hornets around his wrists. For the first time in memory, he was not free to roam. He paced the stone floor like a caged animal, his senses filled with the smell of incense and old blood, the scrape of armored boots echoing from beyond the bars. They came for him not as soldiers, but as interrogators. A man draped in robes, his head shaven, the seal of the Imperium stamped into wax across his chest. His eyes were sharp, cold, the eyes of someone who had seen too many lies to believe truth could ever stand alone. Behind him came adepts, data slates in their hands, recording every twitch of his face, every shift of his stance. They questioned him in low Gothic first, words harsh and clipped. When he did not answer, they tried other tongues, some he half understood, some that sounded like the groan of machinery. He said nothing. He had no reason to explain himself to these men, no reason to offer them the story of who he was or how he came here. His silence frustrated them, but it did not stop them. They tested him. They cut him open with knives sanctified in prayer, watched as the wounds closed before their eyes. They shot him with last bolts, their adepts noting how long it took the burns to heal. They drowned him in ice water, held his head beneath until any other man would have died. He rose again, coughing blood that turned to breath, his body refusing death's grip. They whispered to each other, some with awe, others with fear. One dared call him a gift from the Emperor. Another muttered that he was a warp-spawned abomination. He remained silent, though his claws ached to taste their flesh. Days blurred together, though in the dungeons of the Imperium, time was a meaningless thing. They fed him enough to keep him alive, kept his chains humming to remind him of captivity. Yet even in confinement, violence found him. One night, when the torches burned low, a guardsman dared to step too close to the bars, sneering, muttering of killing the beast before it brought damnation to them all. Wolverine moved faster than thought. His claws erupted, slicing through the gap, rending flesh from collar to hip. Blood sprayed across the stone, the soldier's scream cut short as he collapsed. Others rushed in, laser guns raised, but none dared open the cell. He sat in the shadows, blood dripping from his claws, eyes gleaming like an animal's. They left him there, whispering of curses, of saints, of demons. It was then that he realized something more dangerous than their weapons had begun. Stories. They spread through the bastion like smoke through a dying fire. The soldiers spoke of him not as a prisoner, but as something more, a weapon, a warning, a myth. Even the interrogators, for all their methods, could not kill what he was. They had caged his body, but his legend was already slipping through the cracks. The Imperium feared him, and they desired him, and in that contradiction lay his greatest danger. Even in chains, even within stone walls that had survived centuries of war, Wolverine could feel the ripple of his presence spreading beyond the bastion. Whispers drifted through the halls like incense smoke, carried on the breath of soldiers, scribes, and psychers who caught even the faintest hint of his existence. "The Clawed One walks," a young guardsman murmured in the mess hall, voice tight with fear. "He heals from every strike. He cannot die." The words traveled, weaving their way into every corner, and with each repetition they grew. He was no longer a man. He was a story, a fragment of myth that grew faster than his claws could carve through flesh. Some claimed he was a shard of the Emperor's will, sent to judge the weak and smite the heretic. Others whispered that he had been touched by the warp, that a demon lingered beneath his skin, controlling the rage that tore through the ash wastes and the bastion alike. Priests muttered prayers over his cell, crosses pressed against the iron bars, holy water splashed in cautious arcs, yet still he healed. Still he moved, Still, the whispers spread. In the silent corridors of Terra's fringe, the air itself seemed to vibrate with his legend, and those who saw him wondered whether the galaxy had summoned him, or whether he had simply been born to wander its unending battlefield. He felt their eyes upon him, even when the doors were closed. Adepts observing him, scribes recording every twitch, every breath, every heartbeat. The rumors became a tangible weight, pressing against his mind as if he could almost taste their thoughts, their fear, their awe. Soldiers began marking themselves with crude claw symbols, glyphs scratched into armor and flesh alike, seeking his favor or trying to imitate the ferocity he embodied. Their devotion was accidental, born from terror, but it spread like a wildfire he could neither ignite nor quench. Voices came through vox channels, distorted and filtered, carrying the message farther than he could have traveled in a lifetime. Entire regiments whispered of the clawed immortal, the healing predator, the weapon that had walked the ash wastes alone and lived. Some said he fought alone against entire orc warbands, leaving nothing behind but blood and legend. Others spoke of the mutants in the wastes who fled at the mere scent of him. Stories intertwined with speculation. Was he man or Xenos? Was he holy or damned? No one could say. Even those who had seen him fall and rise again could not comprehend the truth. And in the Imperium, truth was often less important than fear. And yet, amid all the stories, Wolverine felt something new stirring within himself. The whispers, the fear, the awe, they were not just echoes. They were a compass. They guided him to think beyond survival, beyond immediate prey. Each tale, each rumor became a reflection of himself he had not yet considered. Perhaps the Imperium would seek to control him. Perhaps they would brand him a saint or a demon. Perhaps they would send him to die in some distant war, a tool of empire wielded by those who feared his existence. But for the first time, he wondered if he could shape the story, if he could bend the legend to his will. It was a dangerous thought, one that came with the weight of the galaxy's gaze. He had been a predator among ash wastes, a nightmare made flesh, but here in the shadows of the Imperium's power, his claws alone would not suffice. He had to learn patience, calculation, strategy. The stories were already forming, some as prayer, some as rumor, some as command, but none of them had yet reached their end. They whispered not only to those who sought him, but to him, feeding a realization that the galaxy itself was alive, breathing through belief, and he was a single spark within its machinery. Through the bars of his cell, he glimpsed the movement of the fortress above, lights flickering, shadows shifting. Soldiers walked corridors with hushed reverence. Adepts scurried from chamber to chamber, data slates in hand noting every heartbeat. The world beyond his chains was waking to his presence, aware of him, obsessed with him, yet ignorant of the truth. And Wolverine, ever watchful, understood that in the Imperium, perception was as deadly as any weapon. Legends could kill, could command, could inspire entire legions. And if he played his part carefully, he could turn their fear into a shield and their awe into a blade. The first messenger arrived at dusk, cloaked and silent, bringing news of skirmishes in the wastes that bore his mark, of soldiers fighting with unnatural ferocity, of mutants scattering in terror. Wolverine traced the path of the story, clawing at the edge of the narrative. The galaxy whispered his name, and in that whisper lay opportunity. Chains could hold his body, but not the idea of him. The rumor of flesh and spirit had begun, and with it, a new kind of survival, one not of muscle or bone, but of legend. The summons arrived without warning, a stark contrast to the hum of the Bastion's routine. No soldiers escorted him. No doors clanged open. Only a single figure, draped in black robes stitched with sigils that burned faintly in the torchlight, appeared at the edge of his cell. The chains rattled as Wolverine rose to meet the intruder. Claws half extended, the old muscle memory of violence taut and ready. Yet there was something in the figure's presence that demanded pause. Not fear exactly, but an understanding that this was not a foe who could be overcome by mere strength. This was judgment incarnate. The Inquisition had come. He was led through halls that seemed to stretch infinitely, corridors carved from stone older than memory, their ceilings lost in darkness. Torchlight flickered across walls adorned with frescoes of saints, martyrs, and warriors locked in eternal battle. Their eyes seemed to follow him, whispering of duty, sin, and eternity. He sensed them in the shadows. The whispers of the Imperium's most secretive servants, adepts, scribes, and psychers, all part of a system designed to scrutinize, control, and destroy what it could not understand. His claws clicked faintly against the stone, an audible reminder that even here, the predator endured. The chamber they entered was vast, its floor polished to reflect the torchlight and fractured, dizzying patterns. At its center stood a tribunal of figures, their visages concealed behind masks and hoods, symbols of offices both feared and hated across the Imperium. Each carried instruments of judgment, data slates that recorded not only movement but thought, implements that measured soul and will, and weapons meant to unmake what they considered an abomination. They circled him, assessing him as much as a scientist would a specimen, yet with a predatory gleam that promised punishment if he faltered. They asked him questions, though few words passed beyond mere formalities. The interrogator's voice carried over the chamber in a steady monotone, probing not for truth but for reaction. Was he of human origin? Was he the product of Xenos' experiment? Did he bear the mark of warp corruption? Wolverine remained silent, muscles coiled, eyes scanning, claws twitching. His silence irritated them, sharpened their scrutiny, yet it revealed a truth they could not deny. He was not easily subdued. They pushed, using pain, fire, and psychic probes to unravel him, but the claws healed faster than any strike. The flesh knit itself whole, and the rage within him remained untamed, even as he endured. The Inquisition debated among themselves. Some saw him as a tool, a weapon to deploy where ordinary men would fall. Others feared him, whispering of demonic taint, of warp infection, of a being that could unsettle the balance of armies and empires alike. They did not yet know the truth. He was neither demon nor angel, yet both in essence, a being forged by death, hardened by battle, and unbroken by pain. Their uncertainty became a kind of leverage, and Wolverine, ever perceptive, began to understand the game being played. Survival would no longer depend solely on strength. It required cunning, patience, and the ability to manipulate belief without succumbing to it himself. Days became weeks within the shadow of the tribunal. Each session left him weakened physically but honed mentally, the ritualized torment teaching him subtleties of the Imperium that his instincts had never grasped. He learned to read the tells in a psyker's eyes, the hesitation in an inquisitor's posture, the smallest twitch of a servitor's machinery. He began to anticipate movements before they occurred, turning the tools of observation back upon his observers. For the first time, he sensed that he could shape his legend from within the very machinery designed to break him. Yet even as he plotted, Wolverine felt the weight of expectation settle upon him. The Imperium sought him, feared him, and hoped to command him. He had become something larger than a man, a being who existed in the margins between fear, hope, and myth. And in that realization came a choice. He could resist entirely and remain a creature of the shadows, or he could wield their fear and reverence as a weapon, carving his own path through the galaxy. The Inquisition would not wait forever. They would act. They would deploy. They would unleash forces far beyond the Bastion's walls. And when they did, Wolverine would step into a world already shaping itself around his legend, a world where his claws alone would not suffice, but where cunning, perception, and ruthlessness could elevate him beyond mere survival. Through the barred windows of the tribunal chamber, he glimpsed the night sky above the ash wastes, lit faintly by distant fires and the glimmer of distant stars. The galaxy stretched before him, endless and indifferent, and he understood that the Inquisition's gaze was only one of countless eyes that would watch, judge, and attempt to control him. The shadow of the Imperium was vast, yet even within it, there was room for one predator who refused to be caged. The transport from the Bastion was swift, carried aboard an armored convoy whose engines vibrated with a rhythm that felt almost alive. Wolverine had long since learned to read the vibrations of vehicles, the subtle shifts in metal and hydraulics that whispered of purpose and intent, and he recognized these transports as instruments of precision. The chains around his wrists burned faintly as they hummed with energy, yet they were not enough to contain the storm within him. He did not struggle, not yet. He had learned patience. Observation was as lethal as claws, and here, in the depths of the Imperium's reach, understanding the machinery meant survival. The convoy traveled through a landscape dominated by towering spires and endless steel. Smoke plumes rose from the manufactorums, their red-orange glow illuminating veins of conveyor servitors and endless pipelines of molten promethium. He had seen industry before on other worlds, but Terra's machine cities were different. Older, vast beyond comprehension, and precise to a degree that suggested obsession. It was a world where humans were cogs, where servitors replaced men, and where the very air pulsed with the hum of power and authority. Even the ash wastes seemed tame compared to the calculated monstrosities of Terra. Upon arrival, he was led into the heart of a city whose spires scraped the clouds, whose streets were lined not with people but with walking engines, servitors, and armored guards patrolling with the stoicism of unfeeling statues. The clang of machinery reverberated through his bones, a sound both oppressive and intoxicating, and Wolverine felt the surge of adrenaline rise with every step. This was not merely a city. It was a cathedral of labor, a testament to the Imperium's obsession with control, and a place where myths could be born or crushed within the span of a heartbeat. He was delivered to a chamber beneath a massive manufactorum, its walls alive with conduits carrying power and data in glowing filaments. Adepts moved with mechanical precision, scribes recording every motion, every pulse of life, while tech priests whispered litanies of the Omnissiah over sacred machinery. Chains still bit into his wrist, but they were ceremonial now, a symbol of dominion as much as restraint. The Inquisitors awaited him here, joined by high-ranking tech priests whose augmetics glinted beneath the torchlight. They did not speak immediately. Instead, they observed, noting how he moved, how his muscles flexed under the strain, how his senses appeared attuned to the subtle vibrations of the city around him. They questioned him about the ash wastes, about the orc warbands he had destroyed, about the mutants that fled before him. They asked for names of factions, locations, and hidden caches of resources, but Wolverine offered nothing. His body moved with tension and control, every twitch a communication he chose to give, every gesture a silent message. They did not understand that he was more than their questions, more than the data they sought. He was instinct and rage, myth and flesh combined, and no data slate could ever fully capture what he had become. Despite the chains and the questioning, he began to learn Terra's rhythms, the pulse of the machine cities. He understood how the servitors were integrated into the grid, how the manufactorums could be disrupted or redirected, and how information flowed from one spire to another, always monitored yet always vulnerable to a mind that moved faster than machines. A plan began to form, not yet of escape but of leverage. If the Imperium wanted him controlled, he could allow it, but only until he could turn their systems against them. The chains could hold him physically, but he could navigate the labyrinth of Terra with his mind, watching the flows of labor, information, and ritual like prey moving within a trap. Outside the chamber, the city continued its ceaseless operation. Molten rivers of promethium burned. Servitors carried crates of ammunition across bridges that spanned yawning chasms, and the air vibrated with the whine of turbines and the low murmur of disciplined voices. This was a city alive with purpose, yet beneath the order lay the seed of chaos, a whisper that spoke to those who dared to see the patterns. Wolverine could hear it, feel it, and for the first time, he considered not merely surviving within the Imperium, but bending the rhythm of its machinery to his will. In the darkness between torchlight and metal, he flexed his claws, letting them click faintly against the floor. He was a prisoner, yes, yet also a predator. Terra was vast, and even the machine cities, with all their calculated perfection, could not anticipate every variable. And he was a variable unlike any they had ever faced, somewhere in the hum of engines and the whir of servitors. Wolverine knew that the Imperium's reach was immense, but it had cracks, and he intended to find them. The deeper Wolverine was taken into the machine cities of Terra, the more the labyrinth of the Imperium revealed itself not as a city, but as a living organism of stone, metal, and zeal. Corridors twisted like the intestines of some gargantuan beast, each turn, stairwell, and chamber calculated to confuse, contain, and monitor. Chains still clamped his wrists, but they could not bind curiosity, nor could they tether the predator instinct that had carried him through ash wastes and orc warbands alike. He studied every shadow, every pulse of machinery, every whisper of movement around him. Each sound, each vibration was data, a map forming in his mind of the fortress within the fortress. The Inquisitors moved around him like hunters cloaked in ritual, their steps deliberate, their eyes sharp. They spoke in the low tones of the cautious, and every word was layered with intent. Questions continued, probing at his origin, his nature, his allegiance. Wolverine remained silent, yet within the silence he began to discern patterns. The Inquisitor's rituals, the way tech priests coordinated the servitors, the way guards responded to alarms, all were interconnected, and he realized the city was as much a labyrinth of information as it was of corridors and spires. Knowledge could be weaponized here, and he intended to gather it, waiting for the moment when understanding could replace brute force. Servitors moved past him in ordered precision, their half-human forms bound to metal frames, limbs whirring with hydraulic efficiency. He noted the rhythm of their labor, the subtle pauses, the weak points in the chain of command where human oversight allowed for mistakes. The city was vast, its spires scraping the clouds, yet it was a machine built by humans, and humans were always imperfect. Even the tech priests, adorned in their sacred augmentics, overlooked the small frictions, the vibrations in the floor, the slight deviations in energy conduits, the tiny hesitations of acolytes moving between chambers. Each of these imperfections was a thread, and Wolverine, predator of the ash wastes, saw a web he could exploit. One night, as the torches flickered low and the city seemed to breathe with a slow, calculated rhythm, he began to test the limits. Chains hummed with energy that burned his flesh when he moved, yet he flexed subtly, letting fingers brush against conduits, feeling the current and tension in the machinery. His claws, nearly imperceptible, brushed against the walls, opening tiny fractures in metal plating and plumbing that would have gone unnoticed to any but the most observant. Each action was careful, deliberate, and silent, designed to probe the city's weaknesses without triggering alarm. He was a predator, not only of flesh but of infrastructure, and here every wire and conduit became prey to his understanding. Whispers of him continued to spread. Guards, scribes, and even low-ranking acolytes muttered of the clawed beast, the immortal predator, the anomaly that had survived orcs and mutants alike. Fear sharpened their reactions. Their awe made them hesitate, and in that hesitation lay opportunity. Wolverine had survived ash wastes and chains, and now he realized that the labyrinth itself could be navigated if one understood the flow of perception as well as the flow of physical movement. He became an observer of observers, a shadow among shadows, cataloging every response, every twitch, every fear-driven motion, as if assembling a map of human weakness. He discovered hidden chambers where the tech priests performed rites on machinery, whispering to the Omnissiah as if it were alive. He traced the movement of energy through conduits and found subtle gaps, maintenance shafts, and secret access points that could be used to traverse vast distances unseen. Every corridor, every stairwell, every vault became part of his mental blueprint. Chains could bind his wrists, guards could watch his movements, but knowledge could not be shackled. And in the depth of this realization, Wolverine began to plot. Not escape, not rebellion, but leverage. He could walk through the city unseen if he chose, and when the time came, the city itself could be his ally or his weapon. Outside the labyrinth, Terra's machine cities continued their relentless rhythm. Smoke from manufactorums filled the sky. Turbines whined in harmonic resonance, and the cries of laboring servitors echoed down every spire. To the outside world, the Imperium's grip was absolute. Yet Wolverine understood the truth hidden beneath layers of ritual, discipline, and authority. Even the greatest machine has gaps. Every system has flaws, and every chain has a weakness. And in the shadows of the labyrinth, he was no longer merely a prisoner. He was the storm waiting to strike, the predator poised to reshape the legend whispered in fear and awe throughout the bastion. The city hummed around him like a living organism, each servitor, each bolt of energy, each whispered prayer a part of a network he could feel in his bones. Wolverine had walked the corridors silently, observing and memorizing, letting the pulse of Terra's machine cities flow through him. The chains on his wrists still confined his movement, yet his mind ran free, calculating, planning, learning. Every whisper of fear among the guards, every hesitant step of an acolyte, became a thread in a web he could exploit. He was a predator, yes, but now he understood the power of perception, the strength of myth, and the reach of rumor. It was time to see how deep the Imperium's fear of him truly ran. The first signs appeared subtly. Guards shifted uneasily when they passed his cell, murmurs following them like shadows. The tech priests began to avoid the direct line of his sight, speaking through intermediaries as though even a glance might carry infection. The Inquisitors, who had studied him so carefully, whispered in corners, debating strategy. speaking of him in tones tinged with awe and unease. Rumor was no longer idle. It had become an instrument, and Wolverine, predator among ash and shadow, began to wield it. He flexed his claws inside the energy shackles, letting the faint click and hum resonate through the halls, small signals of presence and power that spread faster than any command. Outside the cell, the machine cities were restless. Machinery seemed to falter in tiny, almost imperceptible ways, conveyors stuttering, servitors hesitating, the hum of engines momentarily breaking. Some whispered it was his doing, others attributed it to faults in the system. But each anomaly deepened the fear that had begun to root itself in the hearts of the Bastion's inhabitants. Wolverine observed through the bars, eyes narrowed, tracking the reactions, measuring the strength of perception against the strength of steel. He understood the pattern. Fear multiplied when mystery was added, and uncertainty made even the strongest soldier hesitate. The first challenge arrived in the form of a dispatched squad, elite guards sent to test him, to see if the whispers were true. They approached his cell, disciplined, coordinated, weapons at the ready. Wolverine waited, letting their confidence grow, watching their movements, the rhythm of their approach. As they neared, he moved with the precision of a predator who had hunted entire warbands alone, testing the limits of chains and shackles. Claws flashed with lethal intent, and within moments the squad lay incapacitated, not dead but shattered enough to inspire terror. The survivors returned to report, breathless, eyes wide, and the legend grew. Each retelling added layers, exaggerations, and fear, a storm building in the minds of those who sought to control him. He was not merely surviving. He was shaping reality. Every guard who whispered of the Clawed One, every acolyte who hesitated in their tasks, every tech priest who feared an unseen touch, all became part of the growing myth, the gathering storm. The Inquisitors convened, debating what measure could contain him, whether chains, bolters, psychic wards, or ritual would suffice. None of it would. Wolverine had learned to move in silence, to strike when they did not expect, to let rumor and perception do his work while he waited. He was both weapon and idea now, and the Imperium's chains could not contain what existed in the minds of men. Outside the fortress, the ash wastes shifted in the wind, and far off, distant fires burned where mutants and orcs still clashed. Unaware that the predator who had walked among them now shaped the fate of those who thought themselves masters. Wolverine's presence had become a storm cloud, gathering tension in the corridors of power, vibrating through conduits and chambers, and he felt it in the thrum of machinery, in the hesitation of guards, in the whispers of the Inquisitors. The galaxy itself seemed to bend slightly to the weight of the legend he had become. In that moment, Wolverine understood the truth. Chains and shackles mattered little. Weapons and interrogation mattered less. The storm was not in his claws or healing, but in the idea of him, carried by whispers, rumor, and fear. The Imperium could not imprison perception. They could not bind legend, and the predator within the machine cities had begun to shape a future in which the shadows themselves would bend to his will. And the storm, once gathered, would leave nothing untouched. The chains no longer seemed to bind him. They hummed faintly against his wrists, energy fields biting with minor stings. But Wolverine had learned to move within their limitations, to turn restraint into rhythm. Every step, every flex, every calculated twitch was part of a silent symphony that only he could conduct. Terra's machine cities, with all their grandeur and order, had become a labyrinth not of stone but of perception and power. He had watched, listened, memorized. And now the time had come to move beyond observation. He was no longer merely the hunted or the captive. He was the predator ascending. The night was thick with the hum of machinery, the whine of turbines, the constant murmur of servitors in perpetual labor. Wolverine's claws gleamed faintly in the torchlight as he moved with silent precision, slipping past patrols who froze at his shadow, whispering legends they could scarcely understand. Every step was deliberate, calculated to sow hesitation and fear. He had observed the city for weeks, learned the pulse of its energy, the weak points in its flow, the micro-delays where even the most disciplined guard faltered. He exploited them all, moving through corridors that had seemed impossible to traverse, leaving only subtle signs that the clawed beast had passed. The Inquisitors realized too late that their prisoner was no longer inert. The ritual tests, the interrogation, the chains, they had only refined him. Each method meant to break him had instead sharpened his instincts, honed his perception, and reinforced the legend that now thrummed through the halls. Whispers of his movement reached the highest chambers, voices trembling with a mix of fear and reverence. He had become not just a myth whispered among guards and scribes, but an unstoppable force whose mere presence reshaped the flow of the Imperium's order. Wolverine's first real confrontation was inevitable. An elite strike team of tech priests, acolytes, and servitors attempted to intercept him in a junction of energy conduits. They moved in perfect coordination, bolters primed, psychic wards crackling with energy, every member trained to anticipate and contain aberrations like him. Yet he did not hesitate. His claws tore through servitor plating and psychic shields alike, moving faster than thought. Strikes precise and calculated, leaving survivors shaken, their minds rattled by the speed and inevitability of his assault. It was not slaughter for the sake of blood, it was demonstration, a warning, a statement that the predator was no longer constrained. As he ascended the labyrinthine spires, reaching chambers that overlooked the vast expanse of Terra's industrial might, he paused. The sprawling manufactorums glowed below, conveyor belts moving endless streams of ammunition, promethium, and machinery. Towers scraped the clouds above, and the hum of the city reverberated in every metal panel, every conduit. He understood in that moment that he was not just within the machine cities. He was part of their myth now, an idea capable of bending the fear and belief of thousands. Every whisper, every rumor, every cautious glance now worked in his favor. The Inquisitors confronted him in the apex chamber, a platform high above the humming heart of Terra's engines. Black-robed, masked, and armed with relic weapons and psychic amplifiers, they advanced in formation, voices echoing through the stone. Wolverine faced them, chains flexing but no longer a burden, claws gleaming, muscles coiled. They unleashed a storm of fire, energy, and sanctioned rites, yet he moved like shadow and storm combined, striking with preternatural precision. One by one their defenses fell, and with each victory his presence seemed to expand, the city itself bending to the rhythm of his ascent. He stood alone at the apex, the city sprawling beneath him, and realized that he had become something more than predator or prisoner. He was legend, myth, and unstoppable force all at once. The whispers had become an echoing chorus, the fear of countless souls empowering him, shaping the world around him as surely as claws could tear through flesh. In that moment, Wolverine did not merely survive. He transcended. The machine cities of Terra had taught him order and observation, discipline and patience, yet it was his understanding of fear, perception, and legend that allowed him to rise. And as he flexed his claws and gazed across the endless spires and furnaces, Wolverine understood that the Imperium's chains, the bastion walls, and the Inquisitor's judgments had not bound him. They had forged him. He was no longer merely flesh and rage. He was a storm incarnate, a predator whose ascent would leave a galaxy trembling, a legend that would outlive the Empire itself, whispered across worlds in awe and terror. The apex of Terra's machine cities sprawled beneath him like a living sea of steel, fire, and devotion. Wolverine's claws caught the torchlight as he moved across the final bridge of observation, the chains around his wrists now mere relics of the Imperium's failed attempt at restraint. Every chamber, every conduit, every servitor that had passed him in silence had become a note in the symphony of his understanding. The city itself seemed to acknowledge him now, its hum vibrating in tandem with the predator who had walked its corridors, tested its limits, and bent perception to his will. No longer a prisoner, he was legend incarnate, a living myth forged from flesh, fear, and fury. Rumors that had begun as whispers among guards and scribes had grown into a tidal wave of terror and awe. Across spires and manufactorums, the name of the Clawed One echoed in nervous prayers and frantic reports. Soldiers claimed glimpses of his shadow at impossible angles. Psychers swore they felt his presence within the warp, and tech priests muttered warnings of anomalies too precise to be coincidence. He had transcended simple survival. The Imperium's obsessions, control, discipline, and order, had become the instruments of his ascendance, and he understood the power that lay in the fear of the many. He did not merely fight. He commanded belief, shaping perception as surely as his claws could shape flesh. As the Inquisitors regrouped, their attempts to assert authority reduced to cautious observation, Wolverine considered the galaxy beyond Terra, Ash wastes, war-torn worlds, orc warbands, mutant enclaves. They were mere preludes to the Empire's broader stage, and he now held the key to navigating it with precision, unmatched by any ordinary soldier. His mind, honed through interrogation, observation, and trial, had become a weapon in itself. Every rumor, every whispered tale, every exaggerated account of his deeds was a tool he could wield, a blade sharper than any bolter or chainsword. The Imperium could attempt to chart him, to catalog him, but legend was fluid, intangible, and entirely his to command. In the silence between engines and turbines, Wolverine flexed his claws, feeling the hum of the city pulse beneath his fingers. Chains could not bind him. Bolters could not stop him. The Inquisitors, terrified and awed, had become spectators to a predator who existed beyond their understanding. The machine cities, once a labyrinth of confinement, had become a proving ground, and he had emerged not merely unbroken, but transformed. He was a convergence of flesh, myth, and instinct, a force capable of traversing the Imperium's machinery as easily as it had traversed the ash wastes. And yet, he knew the galaxy itself would test him. The rumor of his presence had already begun to spread beyond Terra, carried by whispers of those who had seen, fought, or survived his path. Entire regiments would anticipate his arrival. Orks would scuttle in terror, and the mutants of distant wastes would tell tales that blurred reality into legend. Wolverine had become more than a predator. He was the embodiment of fear, awe, and survival, an idea that could not be captured, contained, or destroyed. He understood that the chains of the Imperium were finite, while legend was infinite. As the first light of distant stars filtered through the spires, casting Terra's engines in bronze and shadow, Wolverine turned to face the city itself. The machine cities had given him structure, observation, and knowledge. The chains had given him patience. The Inquisitors had given him perspective. And now, unbound by physical or psychological restraint, he was ready to step into the galaxy as a force unchallenged, a predator whose myth would precede him across worlds, bending perception, fear, and destiny alike. He flexed his claws one last time, the sound echoing through corridors, chambers, and spires, carrying with it the promise of legend. Terra's machine cities had forged a tale that would be whispered across the Imperium for centuries. Wolverine's shadow stretched beyond the walls into the ash wastes, the manufactorums, the galaxy itself, and as he stepped into that boundless future, he realized that survival was no longer enough. He would shape the stories, command the myths, and leave the Imperium trembling in the wake of a predator unbound. The legend had begun, and nothing, not chains, not bolters, not Inquisitors, not the very fabric of the Imperium could stop it. The machine cities of Terra hummed behind him, a sprawling cathedral of steel, fire, and devotion that had once been a cage, now nothing more than a monument to his triumph. Wolverine moved silently along the outer spires, observing the city from above, the glow of manufactorums and molten promethium pools casting fractured light across the vast expanse. Terra itself seemed unaware of the predator who had walked its corridors, tested its systems, and reshaped the perception of all who dwelled within. He was no longer bound by chains or fear. He had become both myth and measure of power, a creature whose shadow stretched beyond walls into the ash wastes and far beyond, across worlds untouched by human eyes. The whispers that had begun as faint rumors had grown into stories told in fear and awe. Guards spoke of a clawed shadow moving with impossible speed and precision. Psychers claimed to have glimpsed his presence in the warp, a form neither fully human nor entirely something else. Tech priests whispered to each other of anomalies in conduits, of machines that seemed to hesitate or stutter in his presence. Even the Inquisitors, who had once sought to dominate and control him, acknowledged a silent truth. He had transcended their authority. He was legend incarnate, a predator whose very name carried both terror and reverence. Beyond Terra, the galaxy shifted subtly. The ash wastes remembered his passage. Orc warbands scattered with stories of claws that moved like storms. Mutants told tales of an immortal hunter whose rage could not be measured. And in the corridors of the Imperium, across manufactorums and battle zones, whispers of his deeds began to shape strategy, sow fear, and command caution. Wolverine understood now that survival had been only the first step. The second was perception, the third influence, and he had become the master of all three. Yet there remained a hunger and unending drive. The chains that had bound his wrists were gone, but the weight of expectation pressed upon him like gravity. What came next would not be dictated by inquisitors, tech priests, or even the Imperium itself. The galaxy was vast, infinite, and teeming with threats that even he had not faced. Xenos, demonic entities, and the countless horrors of war awaited beyond Terra, and each would test the limits of the legend he had become. But Wolverine did not fear them. Where others saw the unknown, he saw opportunity, another hunt, another trial to sharpen his claws and his mind. He paused at the edge of a spire, gazing out across the distant ash wastes where fires burned and silhouettes moved in chaos. The Imperium's reach extended far, yet in the shadow of its order he could move unseen, striking as predator and myth combined. The echoes of his presence had already begun to ripple through countless worlds, shaping perception and expectation. Soldiers would hesitate, war bands would scatter, and the galaxy would whisper his name long before he arrived. He had become both storm and shadow, flesh and legend, predator and myth, all in one. In that moment, Wolverine flexed his claws, feeling the pulse of the machine cities beneath him, the tremor of thousands of lives moving in fear and anticipation. He understood fully that he had surpassed simple survival. He had become a force of nature within the Imperium, a being whose influence could not be contained by walls, chains, or even mortal understanding. And as he turned from Terra toward the vast expanse of the galaxy, he carried with him a single, undeniable truth. The Predator was unbound, and the legend had only just begun. The stars stretched before him like a battlefield yet to be mapped, a galaxy alive with danger, intrigue, and possibility. Wolverine stepped into the void, claws gleaming in the distant light, and the echoes of his presence followed, through manufactorums, ash wastes, battlefields, and whispered prayers. He was the Predator, the legend, the unstoppable force, and the galaxy would learn to fear, respect, and perhaps worship him in equal measure. The story did not end with chains or confinement. It began with freedom, and freedom would carry him further than any enemy, any legend, or any empire could imagine.